Grand Rapids, Michigan is a mid-sized community that has long promoted itself as an all-American city. But pulling back the curtain reveals a much more complicated story. I'm Dr. Todd Robinson, author of A City Within a City, The Black Freedom Struggle in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The stories I and other historians, such as Dr. Randal Jelks, researched are less visible. They reveal a city within a city. It's about the legacy of Black resilience, dignity, individual and collective defiance, as well as ingenuity. In the face of managerial racism, benevolent paternalism, the progressive mystique, and the malleability of institutional racism in a city that is dominated by churches and businesses. It is time to uncover more of these hidden narratives and to bring these stories center stage.
We had an institution established by 4 brothers who had actually been in the military. I was walking down the street one day, came back from California, and they knew my older brother, called me into this house in the middle of the neighborhood on Jefferson near Delaware. I walked in and I almost passed out because books were everywhere, shelves of books. I go in and peruse and I see books written by Africans, and I didn't know Africans could write books because nobody had told me. The Free Store probably turned most of us on to our awareness of being African people and not Negroes, and that we had connections to the continent, and that we had a history beyond enslavement.
I've always known the number of significant individuals and the culture that comes from South High School. One of my personal favorites is Dr. Emmett Bolton. He's a graduate of Howard University. He's a dentist. He sued the Grand Rapids Operating Company and the Keith Theater for segregated seating, which in fact was a precursor many years before the Brown versus Board of Education decision right here in Grand Rapids. Again, people like Palmer James and Al Green. Palmer was someone who's my uncle, but helped Al Green get started in the business. Obviously, President Ford, who walked down Hall Street to make it into South High School, which is a street that I traveled. And we are excited to explore this in those relationships of those significant individuals, significant stories that come from South High School.
One of my favorite stories in the history of the Black struggle of Grand Rapids is the story of the mustache protest. It's a story of when over 400 students rose up in protest against a school system that was trying to oppress young people's swag. Can you imagine that? They weren't having it. Many of the leaders of that protest and that movement grew up to be the leaders in our community today.
In the early 1900s, born of discrimination, the Grand Rapids Study Club was a group of women who came together to support each other. Their weekly meetings of self-help and study soon evolved into a comprehensive plan devoted to improving the lives of the Black community. Their motto, "Growing Not Drifting," focused on education and economic development as a means of racial progress, and their work still lives on today.
And then there's the 4 businessmen who wanted to buy property outside the red lines in order to build a mixed community called Auburn Hills. It took years for that sale to finally go through, with help from Fountain Street Church and finally the Chamber of Commerce.
Grand Rapids, more people need to know about your collective stories. I am thrilled to announce my partnership with Grandstand Pictures to make a film about this remarkable yet complex city.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. My name is Victor Williams. I'm the CEO of Grandstand Pictures, and we welcome you all to this community conversation today. One, we want to make sure everyone knows that we have a contest going tonight. You have an opportunity to win autographed books from both of our special guest authors tonight, Dr. Jelks and Dr. Todd Robinson. What you need to do in order to win those books is go to Grandstand Pictures Facebook page, and there's a post there that you can like, you can follow our page, and you can share. you love to leave a message, please do. And we're going to pick a winner by the end of this broadcast tonight. I have two of my partners here with me. One of my partners is absent, associate producer Kim Williams, but I have with me my partner producer Rodney Brown and my partner Jasmine Fuentes. And at this point, Ms. Fuentes, if you can take over and introduce the rest of our guests.
Okay. Well, we also just wanted to share with you the fun conversations that we've been having as we work on this film. We've started figuring out which stories we want to bring in from ones that we know and from the books that Dr. Jelks and Dr. Robinson have written. And it's just been really fun to figure out which are the things that are the threads that we can create between all these different stories of today and yesterday. And so our conversations have been a lot of fun. We've met several times a week for months, and we thought we want everyone to be able to have this kind of fun. This is just really rich, the kinds of things that come up when you bring all these minds together. And also T.A. Amin, and we brought him on very early on as well, because he's somebody who was born and raised in Grand Rapids and has experienced every bit of what we've been talking about. So the book that obviously this is written, that the film is going to be about, it has the same title, is A City Within a City. It was the 2016 Book of the Year, and that the mayor declared. And the sales of this book have way exceeded the expectations. I believe Dr. Robinson was told that you can expect a couple hundred if you're lucky, and it has been well into the thousands. And so we started working on this together over a year and a half ago, and have hosted lots of community conversations because we want everybody to be a part of what goes into it, and have a role in every possible way, including in making the film. Rodney?
Well, certainly. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of this team, and really looking forward to learning more myself this evening. Every time I listen to T.A. Amin, Dr. Randal Jelks, and certainly Dr. Robinson, I go away enriched. I expect to be enriched today, and I expect all of you who are with us to be enriched as well. Thank you for being here.
All right, I think it's my turn now. The Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation allows us to have this kind of platform, and I just want to express my gratitude towards them. My name is Janessa Smith, and I am the Adult Services Manager of the Grand Rapids Public Library. I reached out to Victor a few months ago to ask him what we could do for Black History Month, how we could partner, and this was his brainchild. And I was very happy to be a vehicle by which we could connect with the community around it. A City Within a City is a book that is near and dear to the library's heart. We love to tell each other the story that Dr. Todd Robinson used some of our collection in doing his research. That's something that we pass along to new staff members and that we take pride in. A City Within a City is a book that we frequently recommend to patrons who are coming in, who are wanting to have that specialized topic of Grand Rapids, the history of the struggle of African Americans in the city. Both A City Within a City and African Americans in the Furniture City by Dr. Jelks are well received by our patrons, and we're so grateful that you've done this work and that we can be a part of it. And we're very excited about the film. I will introduce our esteemed panel. Dr. Todd Robinson. Mr. Robinson is an assistant professor of history at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He received a dual BA in History and American Studies from American University, MM from Cambridge College, MA from the University of Massachusetts and a PhD in history from the University of Michigan. Robinson's book, A City Within a City, examines the civil rights movement in the North by concentrating on the struggles for equality in Grand Rapids, Michigan. As Robinson indicates, this bold, provocative framework for understanding race relations in Grand Rapids has a broader implication for illuminating the 20th century African-American urban experience in secondary cities. Award-winning author and mentor of Mr. Robinson, Dr. Randal Maurice Jelks, is a graduate of the University of Michigan with a BA, McCormick Theological Seminary with a Master of Divinity, and Michigan State University with his PhD. Jelks has authored 2 award-winning books, African Americans in the Furniture City, The Struggle for Civil Rights, Struggle in Grand Rapids, which won the 2006 State History Award, University and Commercial Press Historical Society of Michigan, and Benjamin Elijah Mays, Schoolmaster of the Movement, a biography, winner of the 2013 Lillian Smith Book Award and the 2013 Literary Award, Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Dr. Jelks' books served as a stepping stone for A City Within a City, covering an earlier era with some overlapping content. T.A. Amin has over 40 years of community action involvement, corporate experience at several levels, communicator, presenter, and cultural awareness, Nile Valley African histories, international travel and cultural experience, former adjunct professor, business sociology, educating African males to become leaders, West African history and economic development. He has taught in the business division at the Grand Rapids Community College and as an adjunct professor at Davenport University and Grand Valley State University. Amin seeks to contribute to the economic development of the marginalized communities of the world by eradicating poverty, building and rebuilding kingdoms, villages, towns, infrastructure, and institutions where needed, uniting humanity on one accord. We welcome you. We have some questions that we prepared for the panel to start. We will be opening up the floor for additional questions at around 7:25 from the participants. If you use the Q&A function to do that, we will vet those questions and get them to our panelists. We will start with a question for Todd. What is your philosophy when relating to the documentation versus what people want to tell you?
First of all, thank you for having me tonight and being part of this forum discussion, this community dialogue. I think it's an important ongoing conversation that that we need to all invest in. When I think about doing history, it's very personal. I think your own experiences begin to shape how you, what interest you have. And I can recall my days being in history class, and the questions I had centered around American identity, notions of citizenship, Americanness, and that story was driven in large part by a narrative that was not inclusive. And my own familial experiences taught me better than that. Let me know that we were very much a part of the fabric, the American fabric, and what we had experienced was, as Mr. Brown has on his moniker, the part of the struggle, right? The struggle is part of the story. And so I knew that that history is important. And as I continued in my journey, I continued to look for those stories, those hidden histories, or reading across the grain of material to find the voices of individuals who, like myself and my family, were not necessarily considered part of that mainstream experience. I think that when you do that, you have to work a little bit harder to find representation. And so you have to utilize a multiplicity of methods, as well as multiple sources, to really begin to uncover areas that have a lack of representation. So for me, doing history requires you to interface with the material. And it's important because oral history is a part of that tradition. But as I've mentioned in a previous conversation, when you begin to do your research, you can't have that necessarily influence you in a way that taints your objectivity, so to speak. You want to engage the material and let the voices from that particular period that you're studying speak for themselves, right? So you find complementary documents, you find what issues might be hitting the surface or red hot buttons. And then you ask what other issues might be missing from that particular period. And you begin to ask why and seek sources that begin to answer that. But you do that relative to the period you're studying, and you do it in a way that contextualizes the material from that period to allow the individuals, the documents from that era to speak for themselves.
Thank you for that. Randall, the next question is for you. What do you make of the differing Urban League and NAACP approaches to GR gatekeepers? How did each help and hurt GR?
Well, first of all, that takes us to 1909, 1908, and 1909 and 1910 when those organizations were started. The NAACP really began as an interracial organization with the likes of Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, and their white liberal cohort in response to a riot that took place in Springfield, Massachusetts. People forget that. A race riot, as these things were called, really weren't race riots, but the Springfield race riots was in a wholesale attack on the Black community of Springfield, Illinois. And the country was aghast because Springfield is the home of Lincoln, who was, in theory, the great emancipator. And so the NAACP begins as an interracial organization, but quickly under the organization of James Weldon Johnson, he was the lead organizer, it becomes a Black organization. James Weldon Johnson is and his brother J. Rosemond Johnson wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. So every time you sing Lift Every Voice and Sing, you're thinking about James Weldon Johnson, because he wrote those lyrics. And they were obviously to protest lynchings, racial programs with that were happening 1906 Atlanta, 1908, 1917 East St. Louis, 1919 Chicago, 1921 Tulsa, and we can go down the list. So they were out there like figuring out how to protest. The Urban League began out of Booker T. Washington's organization to try to help people who are migrating, first of all, up north, to behave well, to behave and to also start businesses. So they had two different philosophies from the outset, and they kind of played themselves out in Grand Rapids from the outset. In Grand Rapids, the NAACP is trying to organize to protest racial segregation. In theory, in Michigan, there was no racial segregation, but in practice, there was a racial segregation. The Urban League comes along a lot later, and it is a part of an interracial group out of churches that really wants to kind of guide the Great Migration, the beginning, the second wave of the Great Migration of the Grand Rapids. The Urban League did 2 studies in Grand Rapids in 1927 and then in 1940. There are some of the earliest studies that the Urban League did when they used to go city after city and doing these studies, and they're quite helpful, but they had different philosophies. One was trying to aid people get jobs. That's the Urban League. The NAACP was trying to, at that moment, hold people accountable. Now, what is really crucial about this is both of them were middle-class organizations. What do I mean by that? They weren't out there, they were not overwhelmingly an organization for Black working class people in the sense of being advocates for a job. They weren't like the great Asa Philip Randolph, organizing around labor issues. So in Grand Rapids, because we were a church-oriented town and a kind of town of built, that's why I built my book around respectability politics, is that people wanted to very quickly fit in and not organize a power.
Would any of the other panelists like to address that question or add to it?
believe Dr. Jelks hit the nail on the head in that their philosophies were different and their philosophies still remain somewhat different. One is getting accommodations, getting accepted into the larger society in ACP, and there's still push for that inclusion. The Urban League is about employment, it's about business, it's about jobs. And that, to me, the Booker T. Washington approach is really sort of the missing link in that we don't have the economic base formed because they became secondary in this town in terms of pushing for economic inclusion or economic leave me alone and let us build. So their approach sort of appealed to people like myself who felt that we needed our own facilities, our own job creation entities and vehicles so that we then could employ people from the neighborhood as opposed to looking for onesie twosie jobs with white collars, and most people are not white collar.
I'd also like to just add really quickly, I think as has been pointed out by both so far, that when looking at these organizations, it's important to look at the goals, and which is critical, but also the tactics in which they go about trying to implement changes. And arguably, the membership is important, not just within the Black community, but how far it reaches out into the white community too. And so I think those two other areas of emphasis add to what was already said and deepen our understanding of some of the complexity that's going on in Grand Rapids during that turn of the century. So people are making decisions, but I don't think it's as easy as to say that people are gravitating to one over the other within the Black community, because as Dr. Jelks and Mr. Amin would argue, you see that there's overlap in many of the lives of these individuals, right? So they're utilizing these strategies for the purposes to advance issues of racial justice at different points in time. So it's not as simple as dividing these as separate entities because they do overlap, but it's also critical to understand that those tactical differences arguably are real, and the membership within the white community also shapes how those particular community organizations play out within the community.
That leads well into our next question. I'll start with TA. What different schools of thought have you seen in GR for what the Black response should be to managerial racism?
The foremost institution in my mind in the 60s is when we broke out of sort of the beggar mode, was to stand up and say, this is what we demand. We demand inclusion in the decision making. So there was it became known as the Black Power movement or the revolutionary struggle. So there was that. I happened to choose that as my vehicle because we felt that we could control and rule our own communities and not really rely on someone else to tell us this is how it's going to be and this is how it should work. So the forerunner to the school boycott was us standing up against the Board of Education based on them trying to close schools in the inner city and educating our children outside after the 4th grade, master plan. So that was one school of thought. The other was take it easy, go to school, try it. Those few of you who are going to get an education will make a way for you and allow you into the system, into some of the corporations. But most corporations still in Grand Rapids do not hire people of African descent. And the other was the economic development ideology that was crushed during the Model Cities days when in 68, 9, 70, when we attempted to form an economic base based on I call him Dr. Booker T. Washington's philosophy of building something for self, building an economic base, learning, teaching the children skills so that they could become builders of their own destiny. So those were the different schools of thought and the responses to this managerial racism where we were put into corners and then this is where we are and this is how you should function. This is where we are, how you should function. And the young people are the ones who stood up against that. And I say young because most of us who stood up were in our 20s at the time. And most of those who were giving in to the directives from on high were in their 40s and beyond. So that was the major divide there.
Does anyone else want to add?
Yeah, my argument has always been that in Grand Rapids, because you didn't control education, you didn't have a major analysis of the problems that are around, that people were trying to, from my read of the history, were trying to fit into the existing modes of operation, which weren't, in point of fact, ready for them, and wanting, and nor wanted them. And because we're a church-oriented town, or have been, I don't know if we still are, but have been, this was seen to, Black people in general wanted to be good Christians. And I say that respectfully. I don't say that with any malice, but it was a certain kind of Christianity that said, well, we're going to cooperate with our white Christian brothers, but they certainly never cooperated with the Black community. That was early on. You can see people really struggling to be a part. And it, as T.A. has described, it's by the 60s that really begins to change. The problem as I see it for Grand Rapids, and the challenge has always been, is to create institutions that can sustain, that are Black controlled. And that has always been the very difficulty from the beginning. It has been a much more a model of early on, charitable model of white people are gonna help the Negroes along, and the middle class accepts it because it allows them to be in. But in reality, it is stunning the growth. I think that is the difference. And I'm a Black Southerner initially. That really is the difference that I saw when I was reading the history of Grand Rapids, that there was Black people were forced to build institutions outside of the purview of white people. And in Grand Rapids, people wanted, for no better word, to be accepted. And that's a constant theme that I read. Even as I read Todd's book, I was like, this is a constant theme going on in the city.
Yeah, and I agree with Dr. Jelks too, and Mr. Amin. They both bring up very good points, and I want to continue that a little bit by saying that the thing that I realized, and I mentioned this in a recent conversation, that the Mustache Saga was my initial point of contact with Grand Rapids, and you would think from that point, either going backwards or forwards, you would see that type of momentum. But going into the documents and certainly reading Dr. Jelks' book, you don't necessarily see those particular instances of the Mustache Saga, arising. You do see racial uplift and respectability, and I think that we're not knocking that. I think what we're saying is that the white community did not have to take time to prove that. Right. So, and if they were proving that, they did not have to wait on jobs and then prove it, or prove it and wait on jobs or acceptability within the school system. As they were developing themselves and coming from working class to middle class to upper class, or transitioning in any one of those phases, they were still granted access to housing. They were still granted access to jobs. They were still had access to resources in the schools. And the Black community, as Dr. Jelks mentioned, came at it within good faith. that if we develop our own and we are respectable in nature and build up our own institutions, then we will be part of it because this is a good Christian town, right? But I think it was disingenuous for whites to sell that bill of goods because it was a failed bill. And ultimately, Blacks that did that found themselves working and swimming upstream and having to create on their own double time what whites had to do to only receive half as much as whites received. And so I think at the end of the day, that direct action protest where I entered the narrative of the Mustache Saga is something that is abrasive to a community that said, moral persuasion, racial uplift, let's discuss this behind closed doors. It's in the interest of the business, it's in the interest of the churches to keep the image of, as the documentary talks about in the early phases, an all-American city on high as the reputation. Then we need to do something different here. So I think that, you know, there are wonderful points, and Grand Rapids history is so rich because you see African Americans struggling against the grain while proving themselves, right? And Dr. Jelks has found example after example of example where they have proved themselves worthy of opportunity, worthy of equality, but not granted such. There's always an excuse that seems to be there that says, well, perhaps not yet, or we need to go in a different direction. That different direction is in the better interest of the larger community, which is at the expense of the minority community. So in discussing those issues, that transformation, respectability is something that Black community definitely believed in. But respectability within the white community didn't seem to believe back.
Ooh, that resonated with me as a lifelong Grand Rapidian. That leads to our next question. Was there a real civil rights movement in Grand Rapids? Let's start with Randal.
Of course, Grand Rapids was a part of the larger nation. Of course, absolutely, there was a civil rights movement. The problem was the Grand Rapids Black community was so small from 1900 to 1950 that they couldn't exercise the same kind of power as, say, a Chicago or a Detroit. But absolutely, that legal case, 1927, is a precedent-setting case for Brown v. Education when Emmett Bowden and his cohorts go to the Keith Theater. It's not that people aren't apart. So, for example, that 1927 case was not known because there was a major case over in Detroit, going Ocean Sweet case that overshadowed the Grand Rapids case at the same time. But Grand Rapids was a part of it. The people in Detroit are writing W.E.B. Du Bois, and so the people of Grand Rapids. So we're a part of that. But what is different? Population size and institutional building. The thing that you have to remember in the South is that because the majority of Black people, they had their own networks outside of the white point of view. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which Dr. King was a pastor, had started at the same time like a Messiah Baptist Church, except that it had people who are college educated in that congregation. Alabama State faculty in that congregation. None of the institutions of, we had no Black colleges, and we couldn't even get Black people into veterinary school in Grand Rapids because we had a veterinary school in Grand Rapids at one time, and 2 Black young men applied to get in, and there was protests against it. Institutional building is the foundation of a civil rights movement. And you got to understand that. What I was struck by, just on a personal note, I belong to an organization called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, one time called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. I came to Grand Rapids. We had no chapter of that organization founded by Carter G. Woodson, which started, incidentally, Negro History Week, which became Black History Month, we had no chapter in this town of that. That's institutional frame. That's a national organization among Black people. So that became really problematic. And we had a middle class, I will repeat this, who were trying their darndest to cooperate with a white power structure that wasn't going to let them in.
Dr. Ellerman, I know you have something to add. I just see it.
He's right about the lack of institution and institution building. They had a very, very strong church power structure here that had the ability to divide and rule. When people under Reverend Tolliver and then and Reverend Williams stood up for the quote unquote common person, the non-college grads, they were literally crushed because they were trying to uplift a group of people who could only become protesters because weren't into the middle class or trying to get there, just trying to survive. Without institutions, such as one he mentioned, we had no roadmaps to follow. To me, it was an apartheid community, and that's what we grew up under, that kind of pressure. Few people ventured out of Grand Rapids, and few people came into Grand Rapids until really the mid to late 60s. So we didn't know about national institutions other than Urban League and NAACP, who have been here for a while. So we didn't know about building institutions. We didn't know about Black History Week, none of that. When I came along in the 50s and early 60s, we were just isolated. So we were victims of whatever was put forward, fostered upon us. Dr. Jelks, you hit the nail on the head again.
You know, I think in part that question for Dr. Jelks too, I'm sure he had his publisher trying to figure out, why are you doing Grand Rapids? Why are you doing Black people in Grand Rapids? and
my dissertation advisor too.
all the way back to that level. Wow, that's usually they encourage you at that point, and then try to force you a little later on towards the end. But your publisher then says, "Wait a minute, what's the relevance here on a national level?" And I think to your question, did Grand Rapids have a civil rights movement? It's one that I directly encountered. Because, and Dr. Jelks was helpful in that process, significantly so, because as Charles Payne talks about, it's dominated by a national narrative, right? And it's dominated by a top-down approach, and it's dominated by a Montgomery to Memphis framework, right? So when we conceptualize civil rights movement, we think of Dr. King, we think of the Montgomery bus boycott in '55, we think of his passing in '68, the assassination on his life in Memphis. And we lose the complexity, we lose ordinary people, we lose small communities. And Grand Rapids absolutely has a civil rights movement history. They have a history of struggle, they have a history of social movements, all right? And they have what, if you would call it, the litigation cases that would mark them as such. They have the grassroots level engagement that would mark them as such. But I think to some extent, it's our fault as the Academy of Historians in framing that to say, well, we even need to ask that question, does Grand Rapids have a civil rights movement? Well, if you were Black in America in a community, you have a movement towards justice, right? So it's essential to not let us define it by those parameters. And that goes back to your very first point about understanding history, right? I mean, the Grand Rapids story is essential. Grand Rapids Black history is essential. And so from the early days of Dr. Jelks' work in talking about struggle and community formation to the ending period of '75 that I kind of close out with for now in the first book, you see Black people pushing hard to change things, right? And you see the struggle, you see the movement, and I would argue, as I'm sure everybody on this panel would, that Grand Rapids definitely had a civil rights movement.
We also had human rights struggle and movement too. That came up as part of the so-called Black Power movement. And we were talking about, you couldn't get civil rights from uncivil people is sort of where we came down. So we needed to talk about the human rights of human people. And very few people knew about Eleanor Roosevelt's appeal to the United Nations in the 1940s for the, I think it's 27 basic human rights of people on this planet. And when we tried to push the human rights agenda, that became an opposing force to the civil rights movement, as well as to the controllers. So that was crushed. But talk about human rights for all people, that didn't fly well in this town. We were ostracized.
I'm just really, just hearing you all is validating to me on a level that I had not articulated before. So I can't thank you guys enough for the work that you're doing.
Your father knew this.
I know he did. He tried to tell me.
He was in there with.
I wasn't listening. T.A., we'll go to you. What are your thoughts about the importance of neighborhood schools and the closing of South High?
Historically, if you look at the movements of people around this country, certain people move into neighborhoods because of the schools. And especially people that have come to Grand Rapids over the years that I lived there, they look for where are the better schools and try and find residents there for the education of their children. The controllers in Grand Rapids were aware of this. They intentionally designed a plan to remove education in the inner city after the 4th or 5th grade, so that we would remain in this cave, this middle cave. And the absence of a high school really sort of crushed the community, because a high school is important to people who are looking at the future of their children as they grow into adulthood. So having a high school was an anchor. And then to say that the high school that produced some of the top people ever to graduate from school in Grand Rapids and say the school is no good, it's not valid, didn't make a lot of sense. The problem was we were beginning to achieve at South High at a higher level. And that posed, in my mind, in our minds, a threat to the status quo. We started getting PhDs, something we didn't know anything about, coming out of South High School. And attorneys, we had physicians coming out of South High School. And to me, that posed a threat to the power structure and the way things were. So they got rid of it. And the people who assisted, all they could see was, we want our children to go to the new school, not thinking about what would happen to their minds and their personalities being in a hostile environment 7-8 hours a day. And the result was fiasco at Union. High school, schools are very important to the growth of the babies.
I would argue with on the side of TA is that, look, schools form community. Now, if you look at an ethnic group in Grand Rapids, what did they build? They built their Christian school system. Dutch Christian Reform folks built their Christian school system, right? Because they understood the schools were very much sociologically driven. They're very much community builders. And the schools that Black people wanted to own within the public school system were snatched away from them. And I think that that's really important. And that's one of the institutional things, and when I talk about institutions, that were very much lost in the process of the public schools being taken away. Grand Rapids wasn't the only place that there was a fight about. If you go to Brooklyn, in the section of Brooklyn, Brownsville, in the late 1960s, there was a great struggle in Brownsville for community control of schools. Pitting Jewish school teachers in the large against Black community about what should be taught in the school system. So the struggle about South High is a national story. It's connected to the national issues. Schools keep neighborhoods solid. I went to a school that once was, that Mayor Daley tried to keep white residents in the school. I went to the same high school that James Watson went to, who won the Nobel Prize for scientists Watson and Crick for DNA. So now it was an all Black high school when I went there, and I got there in just the nick of time. Myself and Carla Hayden, who's the Library of Congress, the chief librarian of Congress, all went to South Shore High School in those days. And then the city pulled up from under that neighborhood and started the magnet school program. So the most brightest kids wouldn't walk to school anymore like we did. They would bus all over the time. Michelle Obama lived in the same neighborhood I did. She went to Whitney Young, which was majority white in Chicago, right? People don't know this, about 25%, because it's a magnet school, you got to test in. Whereas in our day, we walked to school in the same neighborhood. And I lived 4 blocks from where Michelle Obama grew up. So the kids in my class, we always talk about the glory days because we all walked to school, and we had advanced placement classes. We had photography and art and all this other stuff. But schools build community. And once that school was taken away from our community, it was seen as a decline. So South High, and this is a national story. There are several educational historians who will write about the Black high school experience. That is the glue. I literally fought with this one of the school superintendents about why should we close schools in these communities, because it lowers property values, it's an economic resource, and so forth. And this is the last thing I'm saying. This is personal experience. I lived in the Easttown neighborhood around the corner from Sixby School. When I moved to Grand Rapids, white families sent their kids elsewhere in the Easttown neighborhood. And I was concerned about the school, the way that it was being structured and the way it had been built, because it wasn't an opportunity for learning for my own children. So I think we have to look at these schools very, very seriously. And Todd really, I should say Dr. Robinson in this public forum, really hits it out of the park, looking at how that school was treated.
Dr. Jelks call me whatever he wants in any forum. He's a lion and a giant. So I agree. I really took an interest in education. My father was a longtime educator for 30 plus years. So I came from that background. And I see schools as Dr. Jelks mentioned, it's a community story, right? It's essential to the community, the fabric. And it's also a political story. It's also an economic story, right? It's also obviously an educational story, but it's a power dynamics. And you don't solve Grand Rapids integration issues by closing down South High, right? You don't solve it by saying, okay, because there's a concentration of talented Blacks now getting larger and larger because of the second Great Migration, we're fearful of what could possibly happen, as indicated by the mustache walkout, that we're going to now dilute you and repopulate you and repurpose you throughout the community to try to dull down some of that agency. They couldn't do it that way, but it was an attempt to do so. And in doing that, you're taking people who had a long contested memory of South, that did not necessarily agree with the memory that whites held in the community as to why they saw South as valuable. Blacks had a different meaning, a different understanding, and that was very much integral and at the core of the community. And I think I mentioned in the book where people would get off the buses and just touch the bricks. The principal remembered being out there and students just coming by touching the bricks because they just wanted to be a part of that, right? Just to see other folks who look like you. I remember my time in DC and seeing Black professionals in and around the city everywhere. And it just brings a different step to you, a different purpose, a different understanding. And so the closing of South High is extremely controversial. And as Dr. Jelks said, it is a national story. That unfortunately, this happened in many more communities than solid attempts at integrating, where there was cross-busing or things of that nature, where some of the historical schools within the Black community were able to stay alive. And importantly, I think in the national story, you then take principals, African-American administrators who now are losing jobs and going into white schools who maybe had a principalship are now teachers, or teachers that are now custodians, right? They're not valued the same way. So if they're not valued the same way, why do we believe that the students were going to be valued the same way? So, I mean, it's critical to understand what South meant to Grand Rapids, what it still means. And I think I end part of the book with some folks in Atlanta or somewhere in the South who reconnect over South, right? They just know, I know you from South High, right? That's how I know you. And so I think finding agency and what's important to the Black community and trying to figure out how to incorporate that and not just close it down is what's important.
We've had
Was there a question about whether or not the closing of South or South High School should be made into a film?
I would watch it.
Grandstand. There's your next one.
Absolutely.
The history of South High.
There's so many great, let me interject here. There's so many great stories in the book. And that's part of the big discussion and why one of the reasons we're having so many community conversations is because there's so many incredible stories that we can't possibly fit them all into a 90-minute film. You know, at the beginning, we thought about doing like a 9-part series, right? Because there's so many incredible stories to be told about the Grand Rapids experience. And there's so many incredible stories just in these 2 books in particular. But yeah, the community conversations are so rich because every story touches different individuals, each of us differently. And it's really important for us as the filmmakers to really be able to share that experience with the readers and to try and get as much of what they got out of reading the book so we can take that into those experiences into the filmmaking with us. So these community conversations are awesome for that reason alone. I want to remind the audience, everybody that's watching right now, we are hosting a contest right now. So you have the opportunity to win an autographed copy of A City Within a City and an autographed copy of African Americans in the Furniture City. All you have to do is go to the Grandstand Pictures Facebook page, follow the page. There's a post there. We just want you to like the post, comment, and share it. And we're going to pick a winner in about 30 minutes, 25 minutes. We'll be picking a winner that will win an autographed copy of both of those books. But yeah, thoughts of making this book into a film is incredible. It's important to me, Janessa, because I grew up here. A lot of these stories, I remember watching the film just a couple years back, The Helper, when that movie came out, and then Hidden Figures, when that film came out, and I felt so robbed because I didn't know of these stories growing up. As a kid, as a young kid, I was one of those kids that used to write to NASA once a week in school, right? So I really was really interested in the space. You know, it was right in the beginning of the 80s when NASA was at its height. And I was really interested in that, but nobody was really pushing me to it or making me believe that it was really an option. But if I'd seen a film like Hidden Figures as a kid, or if I'd known those stories and known that it was really a possibility for me, who knows? And then when I read the stories in Todd's book, Dr. Jelks' book, when I learned this history that I wasn't privy to as a kid, that happened right here in my community, I feel robbed all over again. It's like I was robbed of my inheritance. These stories belong to me. And I wasn't given the opportunity to grow and have these stories impact me as a young person. So it's really important that we find ways to share these stories with a broader community. But for me, particularly our young community, these are their riches, and they need to have these riches in their possession as they grow and know that these options are available to them. And so I think it's super important that this book is made into a film that is given to our community. We are working on a curriculum to go along with the book as well, to assist our educational community in sharing these stories with the community in a proper way. We're also working on a video game that will empower our children through these stories, that will allow them to live these experiences in this book over and over and over through the various characters that are displayed within the book. So there's a lot of power in what we're doing with Grandstand Pictures and our partner organization, GRMI-FI, building an incubator for the Grand Rapids community to take part in, and to really make this effort sustainable for the long time to come. We'll be having these conversations, and we want this to be more than a moment. This is a marathon, right? And so we want this thing to be ongoing. We want to continue to have these conversations until we can change the landscape from what it has been to what we all really want it to be. And that's, equitable for everyone involved, every one of our citizens and our students that live in this community. And so I'm going to pass it back to you, Janessa, and you can take it from here.
Absolutely. I want to get to some of the questions. If you have not had a chance to ask a question, please do so. There's a little bit of time here to answer some. One I'll go to because it just stands out to me is I think it was an anonymous. I'm going to answer it live. It says, do you think that the drive to fit in and be good Christians impacted how African Americans engage to this day? As an African American that moved here from Detroit, I found GR to be very different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it initially, but given the history, the present makes sense. I found people here not wanting to rock the boat. They wanted to be accepted versus building their own institutions. And this is something that I have heard at the library in my we typically get new, if you're looking for librarians, especially librarians of color, we typically have to go outside of the city to do that and bring people in from out of state. And when they get here, I am hearing this sort of question from them. What do you guys think about that? Whoever would like to start.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm an outsider. I came to Grand Rapids in '83 as an outsider, and T.A. and I were laughing because I said, well, I thought I came in '83, but I thought I was in '53, and he said, are you sure it wasn't '33? The problem wasn't Black Christianity. The problem was Black Christianity has always been liberatory. Black people always define their Christianity in a different way than their white evangelical counterparts. I mean, we're the church of Richard Allen, Nat Turner, Joanna Lee. I mean, you can go down the line. I mean, we're the church of Ida B. Wells. I mean, all them people went to church. We had a different kind of Christianity. Here, because the population numbers were so, and you had a middle class who thought it was more appropriate to demonstrate a good sensibility, right? The question you asked earlier about the Urban League has it. You know, in Chicago, the Urban League would put out notices to people who worked in the meatpacking plants not to work there, wear their meatpacking clothes on the trains coming home from work, you know, because it was, you know, well, if you work in a meatpacking plant, it's foul and you've got animal blood on you and other stuff like that. But they didn't ask about the conditions about which those people had to work, right? I mean, so the kind of Christianity that people exercise around in the Black Christianity that they exercise didn't ask the conditions on whether people had to toil or to get a house or something like that. And I think that is the issue, because it's not like Black Christianity. We gave the world a world-class Christian named Martin Luther King. Whatever you think of his personal difficulty, he was a failed person like all of us, but he was a world-class Christian. So it wasn't Christianity, but it was versions of Christianity around here. And I worked at Calvin, and I will be bold enough to say that it was out of the apartheid tradition. And we just have to acknowledge that. I know, yeah, Abraham Kuyper, that's right. And you know, ain't no shame in that game, Kuyper College, Calvin College. That's just the reality of it. That was an apartheid exclusive kind of Christianity, but that wasn't Black liberatory Christianity.
No.
I'll just quickly say, because I know Mr. Amin, you want to jump in here too. So I can see you chomping at the bit. I say in my Fires, Flames, and Faith book, the book on Springfield, basically that the God that the folks who were riding on the top deck of the slave ships prayed to probably wasn't the same God as those who were underneath the decks of the ship, right? That's not the. I'm gonna keep that right there for a half a second. But basically, Dr. Jelks is absolutely right. There's nothing wrong with the Black Christianity tradition. I think we need to put white Christianity under a microscope. And I don't do so in that first book. And I look at it from the vantage point of business leaders, because if you profess to be one thing, then it should be acted out. And so it should come through in your business tactics. But certainly Grand Rapids is a city of churches. And so we need to look more closely at some of those churches and look at the congregations and the membership through the years and the messages that are being taught. Because as I say in the book I write about Springfield, that the messages from the pulpit are different. The messages that I grew up with in my Kojic church in Springfield, Massachusetts are very different from the messages that I heard as I traveled through some of the more evangelical white spaces. And so I think we just had a 2016 and a 2020 election that showed us some of these evidences with regard to evangelical communities and the issues with regard to religion. So I think we need to maybe put white Christianity under a microscope a bit more and analyze that in a historically academic way, right? So I'll let you, Mr. Amin, I know you got a lot to say probably about that. So I'm just going to leave it right there. I don't want to go too far over, but Dr. Jelks is right. There's nothing wrong with Black Christianity tradition at all.
No. I can't get run out of town because I ran on my own. Now, here's my position. What I've observed over 50 plus years, when we talk about being Christian, we're talking about loving thy neighbor, doing unto others like you don't want done unto you, fairness, justice, equality. Those were the teachings of the Messiah. And that was the people who followed the way. Somehow, after all the major church councils, they flipped the script and said everybody who follows the way of the Messiah is a Christian. And you can drop atomic bombs on human beings. You can slaughter babies. You can enslave people and still call yourself that. So I've argued for years, we need a name change. How we do it is probably impossible, but we can't continue to call ourselves the same things as these evangelicals who are haters, but they have the power to define, and they're defining us as being like them, and we're not. We're not killers. We're not mass killers. We haven't killed anybody 400 years. So back in the early 90s, when we had a bookstore, we started presenting books, Black presence in the Bible, to even awaken our people that we were those people, and a lot of those people that were slaughtered by other people who were using this name and title. And we became the savages and the people against the Almighty and against the Messiah and his reign. But if I'm living peaceably over here and I've built my community up and my family and we're doing whatever, and you come in and say, well, the Almighty told me to smash you, take all your stuff and keep the young girls for myself, that is not how we are. So we're not that. But how we get away from that definition, I'm a follower of the Christed one. I believe in love the neighbor as thyself, finally. I believe in taking care of the poor and the homeless, protecting the women. But I don't believe in conquest and destroying people. So I think we're different. We just need a new name. Don't run me out of town.
Well, there is one book I'm going to always introduce, and it's by the great Howard Thurman, called Jesus Disinherited. And I think when I went to Calvin, they were telling me to read Kuyper, which I did. But I also told them to read Jesus and the Disinherited. This was written, Martin Luther King carried that book in his suitcase everywhere he went. The great Howard Thurman. And most Black people don't know anything about Howard Thurman.
Right.
And he was the dean of the chapel at Howard University, then became dean of the chapel at Boston University. And he wrote this book in the 40s after meeting God. And he said he needed to write about what did Jesus meant for people with their backs against the walls. And this is before James Cone and Black liberation theology. Yeah. What did Jesus meant before? So when all of these churches, and I'm a part of a church tradition. I'm a Presbyterian clergy. I know theology with the best of them. I took Greek and Hebrew. I know it with the best of them. So to understand that a city with all these churches doesn't mean churches were all through the South. So Black people had to come up with their own definitions of what those churches meant for their lives. And one of the things that, again, education, and this is even toward the clergy, clergy are still going to a place like Cornerstone to get education in Grand Rapids. No disrespect to Cornerstone. I disagree with it because it's not educating them toward what the liberation of their people should be. And that's a problem. And that's always been a strong problem in Grand Rapids because we haven't even, and we are a diverse and plural community. We have Muslims in our community. We have other people in our community. And we have a theology that's trying to mimic a white theology of exclusivity.
Wow. I want to be able to answer another question. I think we're only going to be able to get through one more before we have to wrap it up. But
make it short.
Kind of answered in two places. I'm asked in two places. I've heard Grand Rapids is one of the worst cities for Black people to live. Has the year 2020 with more integrated Black Lives Matters protests in the city changed or helped any of the conditions? In conjunction with that question is another anonymous question that says, should a Black person even consider moving to the Grand Rapids area with such a history of racism?
Well, this is America. Come on now. I mean, you're not going to escape racism anywhere. So if you come to Grand Rapids, just understand that there's work to be done. But I lived on the south side of Chicago, and there's work to be done there. So sociologically, Black people are disadvantaged. Not spiritually, as my grandmother would tell me, there's poor and then there's po. We ain't po. We just ain't got no money, right? So you come to Grand Rapids, organize with people, try to understand where they're coming from, trying to understand their particular struggle. There are opportunities in Grand Rapids. If you have talent, go, but you're gonna have to fight for it because ain't nobody gonna give you nothing in this town.
Is there more?
That's the most honest thing. I think that young people, I want to say this to young people, you're not going to escape struggle, no matter what. You could go to Detroit, right? So a long time in the state, Grand Rapids was the quote white city, and Detroit was the Black city. And it shows in how people talk about Detroit. I wrote an op-ed piece back in 2006 about why people across the state had to come together. And this is in the aftermath of Katrina. I said, one incident, we would be like New Orleans, my childhood home. And the impoverishment, because from 1980 to 2005, we saw what austerity budgets meant and other things. So we're in a struggle. And I ask people to join on my side of the struggle. And I don't have any compunction about that. White working class people in this area experience poverty at a high and intense rate. You go to Sparta, go to Kent City, go to any of those. But they have what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological comfort in the wages of whiteness. So what we have to do is get people to say, you know, I got struggles too, and I want to come and join with your struggles. Out in Kent City and all those, they got terrible schools. You know, Grand Rapids is what, like you look at the high schools, there are 3, 4 high schools in the city that is considered model schools around the state. City High, one of the Forest Hills, and East Grand Rapids. What does that say about a city? What does it really say about a city that you only got 3 select high schools? Well, it says a whole lot. So you got to struggle, but opportunity comes where you make it. I really believe that. And so you got to join with the people who are out here trying to make it. They're young Latinx entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs, and other people are pushing for something new. Get with them. And what we need in this city is capital. And that is where the fight is. Because the people who have the capital, they ain't trying to give it up. And we got to fight to it. And that's when I came here in 1983 as a young activist clergy. That was the fight then, and that's the fight now.
On that note, pooling of resources is the best way out. Dr. Claude Anderson talked about that 20 plus years ago in his book, Powernomics. If 1,000 could get on the same page and pool money for an objective, you could buy factories, buy existing companies, employ people, open skills training schools. If 10,000 did it, there's no telling. With the pooling of resources, cooperative economics, one of the principles of Kwanzaa that we've talked about 40 years, that's our only way, because we've been talking about, I was a member of the board of Michigan Black Chamber and brought the Grand Rapids Black Chamber in Grand Rapids helped establish it. They're not giving up access to capital. So we can continue to beg, scream, shout about it. I don't think it's going to happen. But we do have money. And if the top, population-wise, 10 churches would decide we're going to put our money in one institution, you can call some shots. If that doesn't work, form your own. It doesn't take but a few $1 million to form a bank. Have citywide credit unions pool that money and begin to buy and build, because every time you buy and build, you're going to create more income, buy, build, and that's to me our only hope. Other than that, we're going to have a millionaire over here and a $10,000 heir over there and 100,000 over here, as opposed to collectively 10 or 20 millionaires, 100 or 200, 6 figures, and then they can contribute back more. But pooling of resources, that's the only way to access for capital, because these people ain't giving it up. And last point, when you talked about disasters, I work directly with the Queen of Sheba, the reigning Queen of Sheba. And that's something she's talked about for the last 20 years. We need to establish an emergency force, an emergency fund, so when disaster does strike, we're not left out in the cold. And sure enough, it's going to happen again. It just happened in Texas. We couldn't rescue our people. If they decided in Texas, to heck with the black side of Houston, if they decided, what would we do? We're not prepared for it. So an emergency force in every city is critical. And then we train our young people to reinforce that and keep that going. So when something does happen, we're not totally dependent on somebody who don't care what happens to us. Come on.
I will add that we want you to give some capital to this documentary we hope to make.
Absolutely.
But you all can pool resources to this, then you can pool the resources to everything else.
Yes, I want to chime in here and say that. Let me bring this up and share it with you. Donations for the Indiegogo campaign for a City Within a City film is underway right now. There's multiple ways that you can contribute. If you enjoyed this conversation and you would like to see this documentary made for us and for the generations that come after us, this would be a great way to pool our capital.
Janessa, team, can I ask a question before we go? We'd love to hear from the panelists and as well as the attendees. So the book itself, African Americans in the Furniture City, and as well, Dr. Robinson's book, A City Within a City. What are some of your favorite stories, even to the authors? What are some of your favorite stories in the book? The panelists, again, I love the Emmett Bolden story personally. What are some of your favorite stories? Dr. Robinson, T.A., panelists, Dr. Jelks.
My favorite is always, I'm a William Glenn fan.
Glad you're not in 1950s.
No, I know, but because Mr. Glenn was the doorman at the Panlin Hotel, joined the Communist Party, went to Russia, but also was very constructive in things that he did. He helped bring in Paul Robeson, Eslanda Robeson, to talk about Africa. I mean, he was, to me, ahead of his time in this town. And I find him so fascinating because he's just one of those figures that you would never think that would be in Grand Rapids. And he just, and he had an analysis of the problems, the economic problems that Black people face. And he could have been like the other middle class, kind of moralizing it, but he did have an economic analysis, and I appreciate that.
He was my next door neighbor for about 4 years on Union Avenue. I learned a lot from Mr. Glenn and his collection. my big Board of Education fight stands up to me because I'm into that education and what it can do, how it can change people's lives. So the story about being smashed or crushed because of a mustache, it sort of rang true to me. But I love the part about Dr. I call him Dr. Professor William Glenn, a wise man.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna cheat a little bit and just say all of them, right? I
There you
think
go.
they're all valuable. The legacy is rich. I mean, the stories and we just use individuals to tell larger stories. So Sarah Glover's story is a story about migration. It incorporates the study club. It incorporates gender restrictions that they're faced with, racial issues, educational uplift. Obviously, the Mustache Saga is near and dear to my heart. And for politics, the youth and youth agency, what that can mean for today and getting more people involved. Lillian Gill's story, the complexity of Paul Phillips in general, right? What the issues that he had to negotiate. Carl Smith, you know, the Auburn Hills story is so important. Helen Clater, people like that, in allies within the story, right? But in understanding the structural forces by in which the African American community, Black and Brown communities are having to encounter. So, you know, I think you get Dr. Jelks's book and get started with that. You're gonna be in there for some time because there's a number of stories there, and then you get the other piece of that and you carry it forward, and you have some of the tools that will I think, to a large extent, provide a support system to understand the legacy by which you are standing on, right? There's an incredible richness in Grand Rapids, and these individuals have paved the way. And that doesn't mean everything is fixed. It's not fixed at all. But these people have brought it closer, and they sacrificed along the way to make it closer. So it's up to others to continue to pick up that mantle. And that's one reason why I think I maybe have to cheat and go with the Mustache Saga, Amin, and with that, because I think the youth taking that lead and going to the forefront was so critical. So we need more of that today.
Victor, I want to give you a chance to select a winner of the 2 autographed copies of the books.
Yes. So we do have a winner, and I'm proud to announce that that winner is Shayna Marie. Yay! Congratulations, Shayna. If you would leave us a message on the grandstand page with your address or contact information, we can get you those books ASAP. Thank you for participating.
And those of you who did not get the books, you can come to the library and check them out. They are available. We have multiple copies if you cannot purchase your own. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank you, Victor, Jasmine, Mr. Brown, for partnering with us for this event. We appreciate it so much. I just want to remind everybody that this is the end of our Black History Month program. Tomorrow, Jordan Hamilton will be doing music on our website. And if you can, stop by one of 4 restaurants this week. We're trying to drive business to some of our Black-owned restaurants: 40 Acre Soul Kitchen, Boston Soul Cafe, Taste of Africa, Daddy Pete's. Show your library card, you'll get a $5 discount on whatever you purchase. Thank you guys so much for being with us. Victor, did you want to have last words?
I just want to thank everyone for coming out and being involved in this program tonight. I see a few people still saying that they don't know how to donate in the chat. The donation method is ACWAC Film. So that's ACWAC Film on all platforms. So Cash App, Venmo, PayPal. If you use any of those platforms, it's ACWAC Film, ACWAC Film, a city within a city film. And that's the best way to donate right now. If you have any questions, just visit us at the Grandstand Pictures page, and we'll be happy to help you facilitate how to do that further. Thank you.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks so much.
Bonsoir.
Thanks, Dr. Robinson. Dr. Jelks, Numo Amin, thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Please
to
support
Grand
the
Rapids
club.
Public Library.
Thank you.